Conservatism is a political doctrine that emphasizes the value of traditional institutions and practices. Conservatism is a preference for the historically inherited rather than the abstract and ideal. The suspicion of government activism distinguishes conservatism not only from radical forms of political thought, but also from liberalism, which is a modernizing, anti-traditionalist movement dedicated to correcting the evils and abuses resulting from the misuse of social and political power. Conservatism, in a broad sense, as a social attitude, has always existed. It expresses the instinctive human fear of sudden change and tendency to habitual action. In its narrow, self-conscious sense, conservatism can be characterized as an approach to human affairs which mistrusts both a priori reasoning and revolution, preferring to put its trust in experience and in the gradual improvement of tried and tested arrangements. It is generally recognized that conservatism advocates piecemeal, moderate reform, which follows from its skepticism concerning reason, and its valuing of experience concerning human affairs. Burke argued that a state without the means of some change is without the means of its conservation. But change must be cautious, because knowledge is imperfect and consequences can be unintended. According to conservatives, institutions and morals evolve, their weaknesses become apparent and obvious political abuses are corrected, but ancient institutions embody a tacit wisdom that deserves respect. Conservatives are skeptical of large-scale constitutional, economic or cultural planning, because behavior and institutions have evolved through the wisdom of generations, which cannot easily be articulated. Reform corrects the inadequacies of ancient institutions in light of contemporary needs. Conservatives such as Disraeli might want to create a broader suffrage, for instance, but one must disdain the blind and furious spirit of innovation. Reform must be practically and not theoretically based. I must see with my own eyes, touch with my own hands not only the fixed but the momentary circumstances, before I could venture to suggest any political project whatsoever. I must see the means of correcting the plan. I must see the things, I must see the men. Burke. But to change the state in response to floating fancies or fashions is to break the whole chain and continuity of the Commonwealth. It was not until the late 18th century, in reaction to the upheavals of the French Revolution, 1789, that conservatism began to develop as a distinct political attitude and movement. The term conservative was introduced after 1815 by supporters of the newly restored Bourbon monarchy in France, including the author and diplomat François-Auguste René, Vicomte de Chateaubriand. In 1830, the British politician and writer John Wilson Croker used the term to describe the British Tory party, and John C. Calhoun, an ardent defender of states' rights in the United States, adopted it soon afterward. The originator of modern, articulated conservatism, though he never used the term himself, is generally acknowledged to be the British parliamentarian and political writer Edmund Burke, whose Reflections on the Revolution in France, 1790, was a forceful expression of conservatives' rejection of the French Revolution, and a major inspiration for counter-revolutionary theorists in the 19th century. For Burke and other pro-parliamentarian conservatives, the violent, untraditional, and uprooting methods of the revolution outweighed and corrupted its liberating ideals. The general revulsion against the violent course of the revolution provided conservatives with an opportunity to restore pre-revolutionary traditions, and several brands of conservative philosophy soon developed. Liberalism. The belief in freedom and human rights is historically associated with thinkers such as John Locke and Montesquieu. It is a political movement which spans the better part of the last 4 centuries, though the use of the word liberalism to refer to a specific political doctrine did not occur until the 19th century. Liberalism is notoriously difficult to define. The term has been used to describe a sprawling profusion of ideas, practices, movements, and parties in different societies and historical periods, often emerging as a philosophy of opposition, whether to feudal privilege, absolute monarchy, colonialism, theocracy, communism, or fascism. Liberalism has served, as the word suggests, as a force for liberation, or at least liberalization, for the opening up of channels of free initiative. Liberalism is founded on a particular view of human nature and society. That is, it sees the individual as more fundamental, more real, than society, and at the same time regards the individual as much more morally valuable than any collective entity. Furthermore, this view of human nature suggests that the individual is fundamentally complete and whole in and of him/herself. This view contrasts with earlier beliefs about human nature. It also contrasts with traditional conservatism, which sees social tradition as taking precedence over the individual, and with Marxism, which regards humans as fundamentally social creatures. As a political philosophy in the Anglo-American world, liberalism has two primary senses. In its broader meaning, it refers to the fundamental principles of constitutional government and individual rights shared by modern liberals and conservatives, though often differently interpreted by them. This tradition of constitutional liberalism, classical political liberalism, emerged in the 17th and 18th centuries, culminated in the American and French revolutions, and continues to provide the foundation of the modern liberal state. The classical liberals generally stood for religious liberty, freedom of thought and speech, the division of governmental powers, an independent civil society, and rights of private property and economic freedom that evolved in the 19th century into the doctrine of laissez-faire. The classical liberal tradition, however, had severe limitations. The liberalism of the 18th and early 19th centuries was not democratic in a sense we would recognize today. The majority of people, men without property, racial minorities, and women, were denied political rights and full citizenship. In the 19th and early 20th centuries, laissez-faire economics provided a framework of law and policy for industrial capitalism's dynamic growth, but it left most working people in insecurity and poverty. In the same era, while often favoring social reform at home, liberal imperialists supported Western colonialism. The resulting conflicts and disasters nearly brought liberalism to ruin. The old liberal order of limited government, classical economics, and colonialism went up in flames amid total war and the Great Depression, and fascism or communism could easily have emerged from the wreckage to dominate the world. The development into maturity of classical liberalism took place before and after the French Revolution in Britain, and was based on the following core concepts, namely classical economics, free trade, laissez-faire government with minimal intervention and taxation, and a balanced budget. Classical liberals were committed to individualism, liberty, and equal rights. Writers such as John Bright and Richard Cobden opposed both aristocratic privilege and property, seeing them as an impediment to the development of a class of yeoman farmers. Whigs and Tories. The new queen had a tendency towards favoritism in her politics, preferring Uncle Melbourne, her first prime minister, and the Whigs to the rival Tories. After her marriage in 1840, however, Prince Albert tempered the queen's partisanship. Melbourne's replacement, Sir Robert Peel, was a Tory, but also the son of a northern manufacturer. He embodied the broadening social background of the Tories and their acceptance of the need for conservative reform. The process of reform was rudely interrupted, however, by a great division on the principle of free trade versus protectionism, crystallized in Peel's repeal of the Corn Laws in 1846, which allowed more cheap imported grain into Britain. Peel split his party on a matter of principle and ushered in almost 30 years of Whig liberal dominance. The Reform Act 1832 was put through with the support of public outcry, mass meetings of political unions, and riots in some cities. This now enfranchised the middle classes, but it failed to meet radical demands. Following the Reform Act, the mainly aristocratic Whigs in the House of Commons were joined by a small number of parliamentary radicals, as well as an increased number of middle-class Whigs. By 1839, they were informally being called the Liberal Party. The Liberals produced one of the greatest British prime ministers, William Ewart Gladstone, also known as the Grand Old Man, who was the towering political figure of Thomas Paine's Rights of Man was a manifesto for political radicalism. Liberalism in the 19th century under Gladstone. The Liberals reformed education, disestablished the Church of Ireland, and introduced the secret ballot for local and parliamentary elections. When the Liberals lost the 1895 general election, a political crisis shook the Liberal Party. Until that, the Liberal Party adhered to the Gladstonian liberalism of free markets, low taxation, self-help, and freedom of choice, but after the 1895 many liberals claimed for a political reform. A new politics was taking shape, however, springing up in the manufacturing cities of the Midlands and North. In response, from the late 1850s onwards, Whiggism morphed into liberalism. This was personified by Liverpool-born William Gladstone, who joined the Liberals in 1859. Gladstone and Disraeli. In the 1860s, the Conservatives recovered thanks to the inspired leadership of Benjamin Disraeli and his ability to persuade his party to countenance further parliamentary reform. The tussle for power between Disraeli and Gladstone, the two great politicians of the age, saw the appearance of modern two-party politics in a recognizable form. and their regular jousts at the dispatch box continued until Disraeli's defeat in 1880. By then, parliamentary government was at the height of its prestige. In 1886, the issue of Irish Home Rule, championed by Gladstone, split the Liberals, allowing the Conservatives to dominate as the 19th century drew to an end.